There is a place in the mountains of southern Oregon where the water is so blue that the first visitors thought their eyes were lying to them. It sits inside the hollowed-out corpse of a volcano ringed by cliffs that fall straight down into a bowl almost 2,000 feet down. And for almost all of human history, nobody had any idea what was lying at the bottom of it. It was simply too dark, too deep, and too dangerous for any human being to reach. So the scientists did the only thing left to them. They built a machine that did not need to breathe, and they sent it down into the black to look for them. What that camera found in the crushing silence at the bottom of Crater Lake did not just surprise the people watching the monitors, it forced them to rethink one of the oldest questions we have ever asked. Where can life actually survive? Not a lake the way you picture one. To understand why that footage silenced a room full of experienced researchers, you first have to understand that Crater Lake is not a lake in the way you are imagining a lake. It is the deepest body of fresh water in the United States, nearly 2,000 feet from the surface to the floor. But the depth is not the strange part. The strange part is how the bowl got there in the first place. Around 8,000 years ago, there was no lake here at all. There was a mountain. Scientists call it Mount Mazama, and it stood tall enough to carry ice on its shoulders. It was not a gentle mountain. It was a tall column of melted rock with a cap of stone on top of it. And one day it erupted with a force that makes anything modern humans have witnessed look small. But it did not simply blow outward the way you are picturing. It collapsed. The entire top of the mountain caved down into the empty space beneath it and left a vast smoking wound in the ground. Then slowly, over centuries, the wound filled with water. And how it is filled is the reason everything else in this story happens. Every drop fell from the sky. There are no streams running into Crater Lake, no inlets, no outlets of any real size. Every single drop of water in that enormous basin fell out of the sky. Rain and snow gathering season after season for thousands of years, with nothing flowing in from the land around it. That is why the color is what it is. It is basically a giant bowl of pure rainwater, one of the cleanest large bodies of water on Earth. So clear that sunlight can push hundreds of feet down before the dark finally wins. But that purity comes at a price. And for a long time, everyone was certain they knew what that price was. Life needs food, and in a normal lake, the food arrives constantly, washed in from the land. Dead leaves, animal matter, fine dust from the rocks, all of it feeding a chain from the bottom up. Crater Lake gets almost none of that. Nothing flows in, so nothing is delivered. So the researchers who studied it for decades reached the only conclusion the numbers allowed. The deep basin had to be a dead zone. A cold, dark, empty space with nothing in it to eat, where nothing could possibly find enough energy to hold on. The upper water had fish and plankton living off the sunlight. But down in the deepest reaches, they expected bare volcanic mud and nothing else. A tomb. They were completely wrong. It just took decades to build the machine that could prove it. The tools they did not have. For a long time, nobody could check. Wanting to see the bottom of Crater Lake and being able to are two very different things. The earliest researchers had tools that look almost funny now. They measured the depth of the deepest lake in America by dropping a weighted line over the side of a boat and counting. Then the technology caught up. First came sonar, mapping the shape of the floor in sound instead of light. Then came the remotely operated vehicles, the ROVs, tethered robots trailing a cable back up to a boat on the surface, carrying cameras and lamps into water no diver could ever enter. And the plan behind the mission was almost poetic. They were going to drain Crater Lake. Not literally, obviously. You cannot pull a plug on 1,900 feet of the purest water in America. But between the submersibles and the mapping, they were going to strip that lake back layer by layer until they could see everything hiding in it. So they put a machine in the water and they started going down. The descent. It was slow, and for a long time it was exactly as boring as everyone expected. 500 feet, 800, 1,000. Sunlight failed far above, and the machine's lamps lit nothing but specks of dust hanging in dead, still water. Empty, flat, nothing at all. Exactly what the scientists had predicted. No person could have been down there, At that depth, the water sits a hair above freezing, and the pressure would crush a human chest in seconds. This is why they built the machine in the first place. Then, somewhere past 1,000 feet, the floor changed and everyone in the room leaned toward the screens. At first, it was faint enough to argue with. A hint of warmth in the color of the lake bed, a touch of yellow-brown where the light swept across the mud. The operator slowed the machine, nudging the engines in tiny amounts to hold it steady. The color grew stronger. It spread out in patches that caught the light in a way plain rock never does. Somebody in the room said something out loud. Nobody answered. The machine sank lower, and the yellow turned to gold. They were not rock. They were structures, wide and layered, spread across the volcanic floor like huge crumpled blankets. Some the size of dinner plates, others stretched for yards across the mud. Their surfaces looked stringy, almost woven like cloth, and when the engine stirred the water, they moved. Something was alive down there, in the deepest part of the deepest lake in the country, glowing gold in the beam of a robot's lamp. The machine nudged closer and the camera zoomed in. And what the gold actually was is the part that rewrote the rules. Life that runs on rock. Not a smear on a glass slide, but bacteria in such huge amounts that they had built what looked like cathedrals across the floor of a mountain lake, big enough to see clearly from a camera hovering a few feet above them. And the color, that rust and honey shade, told the biologists exactly what they were looking at: iron. Think about how strange that is. Almost everything you have ever seen, every tree, every fish, every blade of grass, every human being is powered in the end by the sun. But sunlight had not touched that floor in 8,000 years. There was no daylight to start the chain with, and life was doing fine anyway. These bacteria were eating the volcano. Iron and minerals leaked slowly out of the ancient lake bed, seeping up from the wound Mount Mazama left behind, and the bacteria take the energy straight from those chemical reactions. The process has a name: chemosynthesis. Life without light, life that runs on rock. Scientists had seen this before. They had just never seen it anywhere near a mountain in Oregon, and that is where the trouble starts. Where this was supposed to belong. Chemosynthesis had a home, and its home was the bottom of the ocean. Researchers had found it in the crushing dark of the seafloor, gathered around boiling vents where super hot water blasts out of cracks in the rock and whole communities of life grow in permanent night. That was where this belonged, miles from any shore, under an ocean. Finding the same process here in a freshwater lake near the top of a mountain in Oregon in water clean enough to drink was not a small note to add to a paper. It redrew the map of where life is allowed to exist, and the bacteria were only the beginning. As the machine drifted along the mats, the cameras started catching movement that was not the water. At first, they looked like flecks, easy to write off as mud hanging in the water. Then one of them moved against the current on purpose, and the room understood what they were watching. Animals, not germs this time. Creatures big enough to see with your own eyes moving through the mats at nearly 2,000 feet in water barely above freezing. There were worms, thin and see-through, threading through the threads like they were feeding in a field. There were tiny shelled creatures, almost invisible except for the faint shadows they cast against the gold. And anchored to a low shelf of dark volcanic stone were shapes the biologists needed a moment to name because they did not expect to see them there. Sponges, pale, delicate sponges that feed by straining water, a kind unlike anything ever recorded in a lake. This was not a dead zone, it was a whole living system built on chemistry instead of sunlight in one of the coldest and most cut-off places in the country. Enough to send biologists back to rewrite chapters on where life can exist, which left one enormous question hanging in the freezing quiet of the control room. What was feeding all of it? The old man of the lake. To find the answer, the team had to look up, all the way up, past the dark and the cold to the surface, because something has been floating on Crater Lake for longer than anyone alive can remember. The locals call it the Old Man of the Lake. For more than a century, it has been treated as an oddity, a bit of local color that guides point out to visitors. It is a tree, a whole hemlock trunk bleached pale by the sun and the years, floating upright in the water, not lying flat the way a log is supposed to lie. standing straight up, its bleached top rising several feet above the surface, its root end hanging down into the cold below. The records go back more than 100 years, and in all that time, the old man has simply refused to sink. It drifts. It travels miles across the lake on nothing but a breeze. But as the scientists sat in that control room watching worms graze bacterial mats 2,000 feet down, the old man stopped looking like a curiosity, because most trees that fall into that lake do not float for a century. The wood was the food. The rim of the crater is forested, trees grow, trees die, and trees fall into the water. And unlike the stubborn old man, almost all of them eventually do what wood does when it becomes waterlogged. They sink. That was the answer. The lake had a delivery system and nobody had thought of it as one. Every sunken trunk is a package of carbon and plant matter lowered gently onto a floor that has no other way of being fed. Not washed in by a river because there are no rivers, dropped in from above, one tree at a time, for thousands of years. It connects the living forest at the top to the volcanic dark at the bottom. What grows in the sunlight eventually feeds what lives where sunlight has never been, but the wood alone did not explain everything the cameras were showing them. The mats were too large, too dense, too widespread for a handful of dead trees to account for. Something else was feeding them, and the machine was about to find it by accident. The sensor that climbed. The vehicle was moving through water so still that it seemed to press against the hull like something solid. Then the temperature sensor did something it was not supposed to do. It climbed. In a place that should have been completely cold and completely dead, in water sitting a hair above freezing, the reading started rising. There was a source of heat down there, and as the numbers climbed, the cameras began to show a change in the water itself. Drifting across the beam was a faint shimmer in the water, like heat coming off a road in summer. They had found a vent, a real hot water vent on the floor of a freshwater lake in Oregon, pushing warmth up out of the rock. And the heat had a source because it was coming from below, from what is left of the magma chamber that once fed Mount Mazama. The mountain that destroyed itself 8,000 years ago is still alive down there in the rock, and it never stopped burning. The engine. This, the biologists realized, was the engine. The vent was the buffet. The occasional sunken tree was a bonus, a snack dropped in from above, but the vent was the thing that fed the enormous mats, pumping heat and minerals up out of the dead mountain day after day for thousands of years. And you could see it in the footage. The mats here were the thickest they had found anywhere in the basin, so dense they draped the surrounding rock completely. The volcano did not just make the bowl, it has been feeding what lives in it ever since. And once they knew the vent was there, an old mystery about the surface suddenly made sense. Crater Lake is a place of heavy snow. Winter buries the rim under 20, 30, sometimes 40 feet of it, and yet the lake almost never freezes over. For a long time, that was just a local fact, the kind of thing guides mention and nobody explains. Now there is an answer. Warmth. A slow, steady trickle of heat from deep inside the earth, feeding upward through the water and helping hold the whole system just above the point where it would lock into ice. The volcano is keeping the lake alive in more ways than one. People who see this footage describe the same feeling, and it is not fear. It is closer to awe, the moment you realize you are looking at something that rewrites what you thought you knew. But the vent did more than solve a local mystery about snow. It matched a blueprint. The blueprint. Far out in the solar system, past the asteroid belt, two moons are hiding oceans under shells of ice. Europa circling Jupiter, Enceladus circling Saturn. Dark oceans, under huge pressure, sitting on rocky floors full of minerals, heated not by a distant sun, but by warmth generated deep inside the moons themselves. That is the same blueprint. Cold water, no light, a rocky floor, and heat coming up from below. For years, the question of life out there ran into the same wall. Without sunlight, what would anything eat? Feeding on sunlight is impossible in a sea buried under miles of ice, which is exactly why the bottom of Crater Lake suddenly mattered to people who spend their careers thinking about other planets. Here was proof, close to home and easy to reach, that life does not need the sun at all. So they stopped treating the crater as a pretty view and started treating it as a testing ground, a practice run for missions that might one day drill through alien ice and lower a camera into water no human eye has ever seen. Crater Lake, they started saying, is our closest window into the alien oceans of the solar system. And the strangest part is that the window had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. Then they pulled up the floor itself and found the lake had been keeping a written record all along. The diary in the mud. The machines also lowered long hollow tubes into the floor and pulled up cores of packed mud that came out banded like tree rings. Each dark line, each pale streak of ash, each grain of volcanic stone was a dated entry in a diary the lake has been keeping since before writing existed. Read carefully, those layers describe the day the mountain died, a day when the sky turned black at noon and the ground itself gave way. When a mountain that had stood for ages folded inward and left a smoking hole behind. And here is what made the researchers go quiet in a completely different way. That same disaster survives in the oral history of the Klamath people, who have lived in this region far longer than any machine has been recording anything. Their accounts describe a battle between a god of the sky and a god of the underworld, fought with fire and darkness, that ended when the mountain was thrown down and water filled the wound. For a long time, such stories were treated as myth, beautiful invention, but laid beside the mud cores, the evidence and the memory matched. Those people did not just witness the eruption, they carried its truth forward across 8,000 years. The lake kept the physical record, the people kept the human one, and at the bottom the two stories finally shook hands. But the crater is not a museum sealed behind glass. Something has started moving into it. Not a sealed museum. It is a living, changing place, and not all of the change is welcome. In the shallower water, the cameras found something that does not belong. Crayfish that were brought in long ago, now spreading and creeping deeper year after year into water the ancient mats and the fragile sponges have never had to share with anything. Biologists watching that footage described it plainly as a race against time, a slow invasion of a living system with no defenses at all, because in 8,000 years it never once needed any. And the deeper the machines went, the clearer it became how much there is to lose. In the deepest hollows, they found pools of heavier, saltier water lying in dips in the floor, each one its own closed-off world with life found nowhere else. The crater was not one habitat. It was 100, a vertical chain of islands where every 100 feet of depth is a new island with new rules and new residents. And the things living at the very bottom may be the oldest part in this entire story. The oldest thing still alive. Those iron-eating bacteria clinging to the volcanic floor, drawing their whole existence from stone and heat and chemistry, may be a living echo of how life itself began on this planet. Not in a warm little pond in the sunshine, the way the old textbooks drew it. In the cold, crushing dark, where the planet's own fire fed the first hungry things into being. If that is right, then the camera did not just find life in an unexpected place. It found the closest living relatives of the very first life on Earth that we may ever meet, still down there, still eating rock, still doing exactly what they were doing before anything had eyes to see them. And that is where the story leaves us. Staring into a lake we thought we understood, that turned out to be one of the strangest living worlds on the planet. Built inside the grave of a mountain that destroyed itself. How many more pools? How many hidden vents? How many undiscovered cones are still down there in the dark, unmapped and unwatched? Nobody knows. Almost none of that floor has been seen by anything at all. So here is the question we will leave you with. If a living, alien-like world was hiding in plain sight at the bottom of America's deepest lake, what else do you think is still hidden right here on our own planet, waiting in the dark for a camera to finally reach it? Tell us in the comments.